Good morning, everyone. It is with great excitement and honor that I introduce a visionary SIPP data scholar, Dr. Robert Moffitt, Krieger Eisenhower Professor of Economics at Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Moffitt has dedicated his career to understanding the interactions between the U.S. welfare system, the social insurance programs, and the labor market, especially the labor supply of single mothers. He has also authored numerous papers examining earnings volatility, labor force participation of men and women, and family structure. With at least 200 publications and over 32,000 citations, Dr. Moffitt has made a significant impact in the fields of labor economics, public economics, population economics, and econometrics. But Dr. Moffitt's true impact comes from how he awakens and mentors the next generation of scholars. Today, Dr. Moffitt will take us on a journey of charting the American society using the SIPP. With a unique blend of passion, expertise, and empathy, Dr. Moffitt will provide valuable insights about the SIPP and will inspire us to think about the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Moffitt to the stage. Thank you. Dr. Moffitt, the session is yours.
Well, thank you, Shalise, for that nice introduction. I'm going to ask Anthony for the recording of that, because the next time my students say you don't know anything, Professor Moffitt, I'm going to try to say, hey, at least one person said I should know something. So anyway, thank you. That's very generous, overly generous. There's like a lot of people doing research as best I can. But certainly I'm very honored here to be asked to talk about the SIPP. SIPP is absolutely one of my absolute favorite data sets. I've used it for many, many years. I'll say a little bit more about my work in more detail during my presentation, but it's one of my go-to data sets for the issues I work on. And it's just a phenomenal data set. And I've been involved in it a long time, and it has so many strengths. I'll elucidate those as I talk. But even the length of time I have here, you can really only scratch the surface for a data set like SIPP. And so I'm going to talk about a number of issues, both content and history of the SIPP as I perceive it. And I also will talk about what I see as some challenges with the SIPP going forward. And I want to say too that a lot of the issues I'm going to talk about are being worked on by the census. And in fact, one of the reasons the SIPP is such a valuable data set and has such incredible content and usefulness to the research community is because of an incredibly dedicated census staff that's worked on SIPP, and I've known a lot of them over the many years, and it's lucky to have had such great people with the census working on it, and that includes the current staff. So let me try to share my screens. I'm not a WebEx person here, but I think, there we go. Let's see if that works. Okay, I'm going to assume that's all fine and everybody can see that. So the Survey of Income and Program Participation, Charting American Society. So very honored to be able to talk about this. I view SIPP as one of the broadest and most important federal household surveys, and I should really say even broader, including non-federal, for a certain set of topics. Those topics I'll talk about a little in a minute, but certainly I want to highlight policy issues, which is part of kind of implied by the title of the SIPP, Income and Program Participation, but a lot of other policy issues too that aren't in program participation or income per se, and really to social science research in general. It's really covers really the waterfront, and it just has a breadth that's really, really unequaled. Breadth in both in terms of the population, namely pretty much the whole population, not single cohorts or single cross sections, but the raw population as well as a broad set of the key topics that social scientists and policymakers are interested in. generated decades of important and fundamental advances in our knowledge. And I didn't have the time to document all the work that's been done. I know only a subset of the things that have been discovered by SIPP, and I'll mention a few things when I get to the discussion of content. But certainly over this period, it's been a very long period now that the SIPP has been around, really has contributed in just kind of really uncountable dimensions to our knowledge of a wide variety of issues. Okay, so what I'm going to do here, this is what I decided I would talk about. Talk about history of SIPP a little bit. And for those of you who don't know the SIPP, it does have an interesting history. And if you don't know the history, it may be useful to understand where it is today. And also, if you care to get involved with census's plans for the SIPP as it goes forward, because SIPP is a living organic animal, and it's not unchanging. And the Census Bureau and others are always looking at it in fundamental dimensions. And so I think anyone who's interested in that, I'm sure, would like to know the history and where it is now and see that perspective. And then I'll spend a little bit of time on content, although I'm not going to spend the whole time on content because, it's just kind of too broad. I mean, the content is very dispersed, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what I've worked on, not at great length. I won't bore you with every paper I've done on the SIPP, but I'll talk about the content I've done and also the ways in which I've used the SIPP, which give me a certain perspective on it. But it's only a subset of all the things that have been done and could be done. One of the virtues of SIPP, as I'll talk about the content, is the many different ways it can be used, and I'll flesh that out. The role of the SIPP, and what I mean there is its unique advantages and disadvantages compared to all the other survey data sets that all of us use all the time, all of us social scientists. And I should say here, obviously, as Lee said, I'm an academic researcher here. I've done my share of policy research, but I'm basically a researcher. So I'm coming at this from a user perspective. I have not been, aside from a couple of cases in my career, been an active data collector myself. I did one survey that I designed for welfare reform back in the 2000s, but I've not been an actual collector, but I'm a user. So when I talk about the role of the SIPP, I'm going to talk about it from the user perspective and how it compares to other data sets and what strengths are and weaknesses. Every data set can only do certain things, and the SIPP is doing certain things very well, but it can't do everything. So, but I'll tell you why and so many people find it useful for such a wide variety of topics compared to the other data sets that are around to discuss the particular issues that a lot of us are interested in. And then I'm going to spend a little bit of time on current issues and challenges because I have a perspective on that. And a lot of them are methodological and kind of procedural. And these are things that also the Census Bureau is very aware of. As I'll say when I talk about that, I kind of feel as though all of us who are researchers, of course, using data sets to examine the question we are interested in, I think it's natural the way we were trained to simply pull down the variables, run our regressions, and end at that. I've long been interested in methodological issues about panel data sets and survey data sets, which I mean non-response, imputation, attrition, a lot of the issues that I think are very important. I think most users probably try to avoid those issues. They're complicated. They're very complicated. And it's not always very clear on how to address the issues and challenges with any population data set. I've long been of the view that I think that users should be educated a little bit more and learn a bit more about the issues when they use household surveys. And I'll talk about the ones there that I see with SIPP. And I also have some kind of organizational suggestions for the user interface with the Census Bureau there. Okay, so let me start. So the history, you know, going back, I'm sure everyone knows about the 1960s in the United States. I actually see the SIPP as kind of, so many data sets we have, it's kind of a product of the 1960s in the United States politically, when so many social issues about civil rights, about poverty, all arose in a dramatic fashion after the sleepy 1950s. And researchers were part of that. And there were lots of policy proposals all over the place in the area I work in, negative income tax, Milton Friedman, and Robert Lampman and James Tobin. They were all, everybody was proposing the proposals. And kind of what need data? I mean, you have a social scientist at the time, everybody just woke up to the fact that all that people had been doing mostly for that time is using aggregates, like state level aggregates or metro level aggregates. The census, the BEA, many organizations published those aggregates cross-sectionally, and it was pretty, you know, retrospectively speaking, pretty sad state of affairs. So there was enormous increase in new data collection there. The panel study dynamics was started in 1968, so that's part of it. The current population microdata began to be assembled and released in kind of the mid-60s, when its actual data release was later, but it goes back into the 1960s now, is available. And there were a number of other data sets that were begun during that period. And I see the SIPP as kind of coming out of that that whole era. And really the discussion begun in the 1970s in the federal government about the need for more policy relevant data to figure out trends in all kinds of social issues and the makeup of U.S. society, and tied in particular to all these proposals being made at the time and how we might get some data to analyze them. So there's an incredible increase in demand there. All the examples I just mentioned of issues in the 1960s, many of them were about the low-income population. If you go back and read the origins of the SIPP, you'll see that focus and that interest prominently displayed in all the discussions. And I'll talk more about that later. But there was interest on transfer program participation, poverty, disadvantage more generally, and we realized we didn't know much about that. Another interesting thing was we discovered we knew nothing about dynamics, nothing about transitions, nothing about movements in and out of poverty, on and off programs. We knew nothing about ethnic and racial differentials and income instability. And so movements in and out of marital status and family structure types. We just didn't know anything. And so that was also prominent in the early discussions of the SIPP. And as you all know, that's still an important feature of it today. When I get to talking about the uniqueness of the SIPP and reminding you, I think most of you know what those uniquenesses are. That's certainly one of the major ones. So huge knowledge gaps. And the current population survey is just not designed for those things. The current population survey statutory mission is primarily to document the unemployment rate on a monthly basis, to chart employment, and to be able to do that stratified by a number of different characteristics. Most of the data that a lot of us use from the CPS is from the annual social and economic supplement, which asks about last year's income and program participation and benefits and a number of other things. That data is very valuable, and many people use the CPS to study those issues and continue to incredibly valuable. It's only a cross-sectional data set, and it only has an annual time frame. And its purpose is not to collect data on program participation or welfare participation. Welfare participation is dramatically underreported in the CPS. It's just not the focus of the survey. And so for all these kind of questions that came up in the 1960s, CPS is extremely valuable for charting things over time and looking at stratification by different characteristics. But it's not designed for all the things that we as social sciences really want to study. So, like I said, especially dynamics, not, and I'll leave aside the fact that you can match successive waves a year apart with CPS, which has many issues, but that is about all you can do as far as dynamics. So anyway, there was a pilot survey called the Income Survey Development Program, ISDP, which arose out of this. So there was a pilot, and there were 4 field trials from 1977 to 1980, where they tested the SIPP. And there was a very big focus on transfer program receipt, including in-kind transfers. The CPS doesn't really get, transfers in detail on in-kind. It has some questions, but that was another feature of the SIPP. Because in the 1960s, we had really not the introduction of the food stamp program. It was begun actually back in the 1950s and early 1960s as kind of a commodity distribution program. But it really grew in the 60s, and it was eventually mandated to be nationwide in the 1970s. The Medicaid program was only begun in the 1960s, another extremely important in-kind program. Subsidized housing grew dramatically in the 1960s, 1970s. School lunch, school breakfast programs, and of course, food stamp itself. So it was a real understanding that we had to measure those sheet of those programs, and if possible, the amount people were receiving, how much it would affect poverty and things like that. So that was also part of the initial design. Those 4 pilots worked. There were a lot of papers written by labor economists at the time and other data collectors, and began with an initial, kind of seems amazing to me how fast things worked back in those 1977, 1980. By 1983, you already have you have it in the field within 3 years. I mean, to me, to that now, how much time it takes to design a new survey, it seems to me be really rapid development. Anyway, if you go back and read this, I think it's interesting because all of us come given a data set like the SIPP, and we just take it for what it is. If you go back to the 1970s, read that stuff, there were choices to be made, and there were debates about all kind of alternative designs and how to do it. And it ended up going one way, but it didn't have to go that way. They could have gone other ways. So anyway, those of you who've used the older SIPPs, the initial SIPP panels, know the way it began was with short panels with interviews every 4 months called waves, and a new panel starting every year. So 1984, a new panel, 1985, a new panel, about 2.5 years long. They kind of varied in length back in those days, but they were overlapping, so you had more than one survey in the field at the same time. And I'll come back to talk about that a little bit. Anyway, there were immediate evaluations of how well it was doing. And if you want to read those initial evaluations, I've listed one here. There's an old journal called the Journal of Economic and Social Measurement, 1985. I believe, to my knowledge, that was the first evaluation of the SIPP. And evaluation in the sense that people were trying to figure out how useful is this for a study of a lot of different topics. So that special issue just had a lot of chapters on all these different topics: demographic dynamics, race, gender, children, labor market, transfer programs, health and education. And it immediately established how valuable the SIPP was for all those purposes. There's a fellow named Martin David, and I'm sure most of you haven't heard of him, but he's an economist at the University of Wisconsin, who really was one of the first economists to kind of pay attention to data, instead of just taking what was received. But very interesting guy, and really unusual for economists of the time. He just passed away, by the way, last fall, into last year. Really an illustrious career and very, very important back in the 70s and 80s. A variety of data sets. Did a lot of important work on income reporting. I mean, you look back and say, well, income reporting, we only recently discovered that, right? No, that's been known for a long time. I was involved at the time. That's when I first got involved in SIPP, actually. I was asked to be a member of an advisory committee. There was a Social Science Research Council, which I'm sure most of you never heard of. Really, they just took it on. There was a guy named Richard Rockwell who said, this is an important data set, important to develop. He formed an advisory council to the census and had a lot of people. I was on it. I learned all about it and learned about the value of the data and provided tremendous support and advice to census on how to go forward. So there were a lot of recommendations made at that time for the content, of course, which is still expanding, and the different designs. So important period. Let me see here. I can get the full screen. Okay, sorry about that. One of the big issues there, and again, this is still with us today, is the idea of the overlapping content of the survey, overlapping panel design, I should say. That's not an easy thing to do in the field. And for the Census Bureau operating multiple surveys at the same time, it's very costly and administratively very difficult to do. And costs kept rising and sample sizes started dropping because of the difficulty of maintaining that. They might say, why, if you go back and read the original, and I emphasize this because we're back to overlapping designs today, as you know. What's the advantage of having overlapping design? Well, there are a lot of advantages. Most important, kind of obvious one is that if there's any attrition in a panel data set, if you have a refresher or you bring in a brand new sample of the population, you can immediately see if that attrition led to distribution of the variables in your sample that was different than this fresh sample. So that's kind of the most obvious one. Of course, it increases the sample size, and it might be argued it'd be better to do it that way than just having a single panel. And it may allow you to study changes over time a little bit better. So lots of issues there, but it was very difficult operationally. And so there was a big redesign around 1996, and Census stopped doing overlapping panels, and they started just starting one panel, carrying it for 4 years, still interviewing every 4 months, but go for 4 years, stop, start a new one, no overlap, So that began in 1996, and again, those of you who've gone back and looked at the data, all these histories of the different panels and their lengths and so on. The National Academy of Sciences has developed an interest in the SIPP, and they've issued a bunch of reports, which if you're interested in the history and also kind of the choices that have been made over time, that led us to where we are today, read those. I mentioned just a couple here, 2009, 2018. The 2009 one, I won't go into detail about the near-death experience, since SIPP almost got canceled. But I will say only one thing, for those of you out there who are users today, the reason it didn't get canceled is because the research community had an outpouring of support, to Congress, and sometimes your help is needed. So same thing almost happened in the NLS, by the way, if you BLS survey a few years ago. I used to be involved in these committees in Washington that were lobbying Congress to try to support these data sets, and I was pretty heavily involved in the NLS one. I wasn't involved in the SIPP one back in 2006, but anyway, that's another topic, I suppose. And anyway, long story short, was that costs continued to be very high. It's been on these fixed non-overlapping panels, and then starting in 2014 survey, after a long period of redesign to generate what was called the re-engineered SIPP, I went back now to an annual survey. So that was the major change, not interviewing everybody every 4 months, and 4 years in length. So the 4 very common there. Event history calendars to try to more accurately, retrospectively get the timing within the year of the different events that happen in people's lives. But then again, going back to the overlap, to starting a new one every year. And I won't go into details about the, 2014 and the 2015, 2018, 2019. You can read all that in the user's guide. But anyway, that's with the new design. And we're back to overlapping panels, which have the advantage I talked about before for overlapping panels. But that is, again, I guess my view is, and again, I'm just a user, but overlapping panels are tough. You've got to have all these different panels in the field at the same time. It's not easy to do. It's costly, but we have them now, and as far as I can tell, the panel CISP is doing a great job with them. But I wouldn't be surprised if they're continuing to be operational administrative issues in doing that. So, but I'm not an expert on that, so I'll move on. Okay, so a summary here is that SIPP has had its ups and downs, continued redesigns to maintain data quality and keep field burden and cost under control. But I mean, hey, look, we've got data now almost continuous back to 1983. If you look at the cohorts, there are a couple of little gaps here and there for years, but pretty much we have it. If you include all the years in every panel that's been started, it's almost 40 years of data, and I do have one project where I've gone back to the 80s. In fact, I have two, where I've gone back to 1983 all the way up to the present, and for certain kind of welfare issues I've discussed. I don't know how many people are still doing that, but, I mean, you have the opportunity, okay? So really an unparalleled record here, I think, when you add it all up. Okay, so what about the content? I always laugh at the title of the SIPP, Income and Program Participation, because back in the beginning, that's what it was all, everybody was saying that's what it's about. And by income, it didn't mean like the CPS, we're looking at the equally, we're not looking equally at everybody. Of course, we do lots of papers now on general income inequality using the SIPP. I would think it's fair to say if you just counted up the number of papers on economic inequality, at least, there've been more done with the CPS. I mean, that's just, I'm stating as a fact, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. It's kind of the standard data set, but SIPP can certainly be used by that. But if you go back to the early discussions, when they talked about income, they were talking about income kind of the lower, lower income population in the United States, poverty, and income inequality at the bottom, all kinds of issues related to that. Not even then to the exclusion of the middle class and the upper income distributions, but that was the emphasis. And program participation, obviously, right there, let's get data on people's program participation and the benefits they're receiving, which was we felt to be a particular lack in other data sets like the CPS. So that from the title, and of course we still have the same title, that seems to be the main mission of the data set. And even if you look right now on the SIPP webpage, it says the main objective of SIPP is to provide the accurate and comprehensive information about the income program for the individual. So, but the second sentence on the SIPP webpage after that, however, it can be used for X, Y, and Z also. So we all know that. And if you look at the program of this conference, you can just see that. So here's it's just new. Maybe Jason can say later, I haven't seen it before, and it's been kind of been showing around anyway. United States with all the income, wealth, health insurance, demographics, commuting, public programs, health, assets, poverty. The SIPP is turned into a general purpose social science data set. Okay, there's no question about that. And the breadth is one of the key advantages of it. I went back and tried to find highly cited papers, and just in the last few years, and this is doing only the last like 10 years or so, I found 3 papers. Google saw 401 in the sociology paper in the American Sociological Review, Economics Journal, the American Economics Journal, Economic Policy, 300 sites, 291 for this one on racial. I think this was in more of a demographic journal, population research and policy review. Yeah, and if you go back further, I didn't do the full search. You can easily find papers with thousands of sites, 900, 800, 700. Very influential research has been done with the SIPP if you look at the history. Of course, like all sites, the most recent ones haven't accumulated those sites, but these aren't very old, and they already have hundreds and hundreds of sites. So just pick out a few topics here, and just to illustrate the content and breadth and the influence, of work done on with SIPP. If you look over the agenda for this conference, yes, all kinds of papers on transfer program participation and poverty. I saw papers on social assistance, women and families in poverty. I think that one was just earlier this morning. SSI, the child tax credit. CHIP, that's the Children's Health Insurance Program. The social safety net in general, unemployment insurance, the universal basic income, all kinds of papers on these programs, which the title of SIPP implies. But you just go through the program today, tomorrow, and all these other topics: scarring effects of job loss, health effects of income volatility, machine learning, and wealth at the local level. Now, there's one you should all, I really want to listen to that one. Bank credit and home ownership is a very interesting paper you should try to listen to on the agenda. Climate change, risk taking. And of course, the gender wage gap, which, is a very kind of solid, social science topic of tremendous interest. And these others are all a little bit more specialized than that. But I didn't list them all because there's just so many different topics here. So really a lot of different topics, and it's just a general purpose data set, no question about it. General source of research and households and their full socio-demographic dimensions. So I want to say a little bit about my work, because I have not done everything, obviously, and I haven't used SIPP in all the ways that other people have used it. Most of my work with the SIPP has been on this traditional kind of goal of it, and that is low-income transfer programs. So I've studied all these different ones with the SIPP. TANF and SNAP, that's the food stamp program. WIC, the Women's Interest in Children program, the ITC. And I've looked at effects on labor supply, earnings, program participation, demography, and my kind of demographic hat, because I do population research and family structure and marriage, the effects of all these programs on that. I should say I'll also, do work that's just purely descriptive. And, I'll say some more about it in a minute, but SIPP has just a descriptive usefulness too. You don't have to be always doing causal research. And some people say the descriptive work is more important, that just some facts out there is what really gets people excited. Most recently, I've done some work on trends in employment volatility. That's something I've worked on for a long time, and my main data set there has always been the panel study of income dynamics, the PSID. But I did a paper with my co-authors Michael Carr and Emily Wiemers using the SIPP. And I'll come back to that a little bit. We actually used the synthetic beta SIPP, which is a matched SIPP to administrative earnings records. But we used the survey too, and we looked at employment volatility. So that's a very big topic in labor economics now, and in economics in general, even macroeconomics. And found SIPP to be extremely useful for that. So there's that. My first paper, just for the record, actually used the ISDP even before the SIPP. So and then a guy named Tom Fraker, who's a mathematical, on the effect of food stamps on labor supply. So, I've just done so many more since then. And the SIPP is one I call my go-to data sets, And I want to give a little shout out to all my current co-authors: Carolina Cardona, Michael Carr, some COSAR, Gwen Paula, Jen Roth, Emily Team, Math is on. I find a lot of people really interested in the SIPP, and that's testified by the conference. So I don't have the slide here, but let me just say about how I've used the SIPP. And because I keep saying that it's useful in many different dimensions. First of all, I've done several papers, which is one SIPP wave. One SIPP wave, it's a purely cross-sectional data set. That first paper, I work on income programs on labor supply, several papers just on that. And why? Well, it's just better than the CPS or anything else that's out there, really. For that study, you've got the entry year program. I've used the PSID. I'll talk about the PSID too. But you've got really program participation at a very detailed level, and you got it within the year. So use of the SIPP just purely cross-sectional is, I think, very prominent, useful, completely. Kind of another variant of that is to use as a repeated cross-section. Now that we have all these panels, I've done several papers where I'm just doing cross-sectional work at each SIPP panel, but looking over time and looking at trends and whatever. So that's another usefulness of it. I haven't actually done a whole lot on short-term dynamics, within the year, month to month, or even quarter to quarter, 4 month to 4, wave to wave, either. A lot of papers here at the conference use that data, and it's extremely valuable. Again, where are you going to go? If you want those short-term dynamics, and there's really no alternative to SIPP. SIPP is it, and it's great. But to illustrate the usefulness of the SIPP, you can combine these things. You can combine the usefulness of the short-term dynamics with a multiple repeated cross-section by looking at transitions, within a panel, and looking at those same transitions in subsequent panels and panels over time. So the usefulness there is also, combining the two, and that's also been done. So, it's another source of kind of dimension to add to all the others that the SIPP has. I should say I've done also just purely descriptive papers, just charting things. My title here is Charting American Society. I mean, you always got to start with just what the facts are, and then you go into the question of why and start doing your causal analysis or whatever you do, correlation analysis. But just descriptive stuff. Again, most of my work on descriptive has been on policy programs and program participation and trends in that. And a couple of my co-authors and I are presenting a paper tomorrow on that work, descriptive work. But really important, valuable stuff. And again, SIPP is it's what's really been used. Now, I want to say about that paper on employment volatility. I did use the so-called synthetic data set, which is a synthetic data set that was created. I'll say some more about it later in my talk here, which matches as a SIPP survey respondents to Social Security earnings records, and it's also Social Security benefit records. Aside from the fact that administrative earnings might be more accurate than survey records. Aside from that, actually, in some ways, the more important issue was that matched each respondent to their lifetime earnings records. So you can look at lifetime earnings dynamics, at least, with that data set. So you could combine short-term dynamics within a single panel, and with this particular data, earnings dynamics over a lifetime. So really a valuable data set. I'll come back to that. I should say too, by the way, on all these topics, go back here, of all the topics here, you should all be aware here of all these topics that the Census Bureau has a number of subject matter experts. And if you're interested in one of these topics in health, let's go to, the census and say, hey, I want to talk to the subject matter in health and learn more about the questions and make sure I understand them, what's there and what's not. And, make use of the people on the SIPP staff for that. Okay, so the role of the SIPP, I've already alluded to the CPS a lot. There are a lot of other federal household surveys, obviously. A lot of them are purely cross-sectional. A lot of them are just limited in scope. They're intended for a particular purpose, health, in HIS or something like that, and not broad purpose. There are panels, the NLS cohorts and the Health and Retirement Survey, again, special populations. So, and then there's a PSAD, and I'm a big PSAD user and been very involved in that data set. I view the most obvious difference is that PSAD, because of its length, is very good for kind of life cycle analysis over the whole lifetime, because you're following the same people. whereas the SIPP has the short-term dynamics. That's too crude because, as I just mentioned, the SIPP has many other usefulnesses too. So I won't go into it more, but I'm a user of both, and I really, for my program participation stuff, I usually use the SIPP now and not the PSAT, even though I started off kind of using the PSAT for program participation. But PSAT has many things in it, like consumption, for example. Anyway, okay, uniqueness of the SIPP. Let me just say, I'm not the first to point all this stuff out. So I'm just kind of reiterating things other people have said. This is all in these National Academy panel reports. Anyway, the panel nature, the short-term dynamics, the incredibly comprehensive content, the policy, content in there, almost 40 years of data, no extent household survey with these characteristics. I should say, by the way, my causal work, when you look at people who work on program participation like I do, you scratch that literature, and 90% of it uses cross-state variation. Now, maybe in a difference framework, but still you're using cross-sectional variation. And SIPP has state identifiers. And I won't go into, SIPP is not exactly state representative, but you can still use it for a DID analysis. And that's another valuable aspect of the SIPP data set, which I could talk more about. Maybe other people here who are listening during the Q&A have to tell me if they use the state nature and if they've found that useful in the SIPP. I would say this, and I have been involved in Washington, committees advocating for data sets in Congress and over various periods, and the SIPP is primarily, I'm an academic, okay, so I read research first. I see it as a very valuable research tool and for understanding society. It does not have a kind of mandated congressional purpose, like the CPS does. There's many of the other federal data sets. So it doesn't have to report, some statistic, I may be mistaken now, census staff can correct me if I'm wrong about that, but certainly not as prominently. It is used by a lot of federal agencies for simulation models and looking at their own programs. And I mentioned a few there also on the Hill. And if you look at research committees on the Hill, they've used it a lot. So it's widely used within the federal government, not just put out by census for the user community. I see that as a kind of a unique characteristic, and I'll come back to that in some of my thoughts about the future of SIPP and what might be happening from here on out. But I think that's something at least I see. Issues and challenges. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some things here. Administrative data match, synthetic data, imputation for missing data, and household non-response. So as I said, I've long been interested in these survey issues, which occur in every household survey data set. Maybe they take a particularly unique, special form in the SIPP, but they're very, very common. And the Census Bureau is working on all of these right now in depth. And so I'm going to comment on those. And I want to emphasize how important these are. I want to emphasize how important and so valuable it is that Census is working on these things and some of the challenges going forward. And I also want to make the pitch here. It's a very difficult problem that I don't think that users are quite aware of some of these things to the issue that I would prefer them to be when they do their analyses, and I'll comment on that as I go along. Management, I'll just didn't know what kind of title to give that. I'm going to say something about advisory groups, regular reports to Congress, and also privacy. So you'll see what I'm talking about when I get to those. So, okay. So I'm not going to make recommendations for new content. That's one thing I'm not going to do here. I mean, I have my content. I would like to see, hey, more program participation questions. But, SIPP is already a long survey. You've got to be very concerned about respondent burden when you start adding a new content. You also have to be careful about changing content because it might create longitudinal inconsistencies in some of the measures. Cost, of course, is important in content. And what's the scientific priority here? So I think it requires a discussion of the user community in general to decide on new content. And I'll say a little bit more about that when I talk about advisory groups. And I'm not going to talk about operational challenges. That's not my specialty, and I'm not an insider at Census to talk about those. But I believe there are issues there and are critically important to the operation and future of the SIPP. Okay, the administrative data match. High priority has been discussed many, many times, and in many different federal surveys, has many different uses. It can be useful for imputation for missing data. It can be useful for attrition and for misreporting and particularly underreporting program participation, which is benefits, which I still view as obviously, agree with me that one of the purposes of the SIPP, and this is undergoing discussions at Census, so no question about it. It has a lot of different advantages. And everybody, you know, when I hear people, everybody says, okay, that's the solution to the problem and we should all do it and jump on board. Maybe I should just kind of emphasize the difficulties with it. First of all, only a limited set of economic variables are even available. So all of you people out there working on, you know, family structure or something, I'm not sure exactly where you're going to go to get some quote unquote valid administrative data sets. There actually are some, maybe from vital statistics, but you know, I mean, we have almost 3,000 variables, like 2,900 variables here. How many of them are available somewhere? Well, the ones that are available, like earnings and maybe receipt of benefits, are very important. So no question, they might say they have outside influence, importance, and weight. But just keep in mind, this is administrative data set is useful for a smaller set of variables, but for the one that's available, really important and very important for the historical uses of the SIPP and all the things people use it for. Second thing is a lot of the data sets out there aren't, you know, like easily obtained. Even getting, for instance, to get administrative data from another federal agency requires some negotiation, much less going to the state level and getting those data sets is a big, big problem. I won't belabor that, and people who've worked on this know it's not a panacea, but I think everyone agrees that it's something to be worked on very hard, and Census is doing that. Another problem is that use of those administrative data will often require FSRDC access, not a public use file. And so there you go. You know, it's just use and access is an issue there. So anyway, it's a high priority item. Census is aware of this, and I'll mention it, the ways in which they're using it a little bit later. Lots of other surveys, you know, the poverty statistics branch is working on it as use of the definition of poverty rates. That's the CPS though. Okay, synthetic data. I just want to put a plug in for synthetic data because I did use, now that I've been a user of it, the so-called SIPP synthetic beta SSB was a data set that matched Social Security earnings records and benefit data to each individual over a large number of panels. It was synthetic because it was generated by a random generator model, and it used multiple computation to allow the user to see the amount of noise that was generated in the data. And particularly easy to use, actually, when you were given the multiple imputes. I found it extremely valuable. Unfortunately, it's been inoperative since last September, and but I hope the census will reinvigorate that particular data set and explore others, because and just work more on this general idea of matching both earnings, social earnings, and other benefits, and produce these kind of files. Kind of a brave new world, and FSRDCs have their problems, but synthetic data sets, if a synthetic data set is working, you use it on your laptop, okay? I mean, I mean, you just, it's not the real data, so it doesn't have the same confidentiality concerns. There's something called the gold standard file where you can check to make sure that the synthetic data was giving you the right, quote unquote, right answer. The issues about synthetic data, we can talk about them in Q&A if people want to, and learn a little more about it myself. Both challenging but valuable. I'll look forward in the Q&A for census's progress on the SSB or some replacement. Okay, so imputation for missing data. Again, I just feel as though users are not quite aware of the issues here. In the 2001 panel, I just looked up one old report. If you're talking about when 49 point, only 50% of the respondents in SIPP had an imputed value of at least one income reported. I pulled it from an old report. I didn't bother going to look at all those things. The SIPP census has paid a huge amount of time to this, and they have a very kind of elaborate way of imputing values, and they're making great strides in improving it. There's something called the SRMI, the sequential regression multiplication method, which has a lot of advantages over hot deck. But I just ask, users here, how many people have actually looked at the topic flag? There's a topic flag, on the SIPP. It says whether that was imputed. How many people have used it? It does a sensitivity test, like run your regressions with and without the imputeds. I mean, do something simple, just to handle it. The nice thing about the new methods for sequential regression multiplication is that multiplication, with all its pros and cons, its main usefulness is to make it easier for the user to handle random imputations, because when you multiply impute, all you're doing is giving a bunch of implicates, and then you just run it on all of them and take the average, something like that. But you get the standard errors right, and you've taken into account, the multiple imputation. So this is a case where I feel like census is they know exactly what's going on here. I don't think the users are, and there's some education I think that's needed here to educate the user community on the proper way to use these, to deal with this problem when they're running the regressions. And users prefer not to have to learn all that stuff, but so anyway, bias and precision, that's kind of obvious. Here's I'll talk about the SRMI here. And there are lots of issues with imputation, but I didn't want to make this a technical point, but I'll just also again make the point that I think the users need to understand the issues and know how to deal with it. Their analysis is a bit better than they do right now. I don't think users are on top of this, and I think they need some census guidance on how to deal with it. If anybody reads the user's guide, and I don't know how many people there's a lot of suggestions in there on how to do it. Selection on unobservables is another issue. A lot of work from the SIPP, indicating there's misreport, even conditional on what you might use in a hot deck or a SRMI, which you're just using the variables you've got. There might be some selection on unobservables, who doesn't respond and who does respond. That's a more difficult problem. Ideally, administrative data are useful for that, and administrators are now being used in this new SRMI procedure. So that's great. And I'm really looking forward to census's development on this. It's really important. And I'm hoping that the user community will appreciate and make use of all the great stuff that census is doing. The panel data nature actually is another big issue with imputation. Do you do cross-wave imputation, take into account lagged values, or somehow do it jointly? Very difficult problem. But it is an issue with the SIPP and with imputation of the SIPP, and I'll just leave it at that. Attrition is a problem. Here's a little cartoon I saw in the New Yorker about attrition. I've worked on attrition mostly in the PSID. I haven't done any work. Well, in my most recent paper on earnings volatility, we did some special adjustments for attrition, because at earnings, one of the problems, for example, that's just an example. Okay, earnings volatility. Look at earnings volatility. So you're looking from either 4 month to 4 month or year to year, changes in something. And the work I've done always shows that the people who are most likely to attrit are people who have unstable histories, whether it's an unstable earnings history, family structure history, migration history. They're far more likely to attrite. And whether that affects cross-sectional distributions is one question, but it definitely affects volatility, measures. You're losing all the highly volatile people. So when I did the survey, I did, the paper I did with Mike Carr and Emily Weimers, we actually developed special weights because we need for attrition on dynamics, because there you want to lose the whole history, and you want to look at attrition by your history, re-weight, so the people who have the unstable histories, get up-weighted because they're missing, and who have stable histories get down-weighted. So the panel data introduces a whole new issue there. And attrition is a problem in the SIP, like all panels, so we need to belabor that. Household non-response, maybe I'll skip that. So again, has anybody read the SIP User's Guide? SIP Census has spent a tremendous amount of time developing weights for non-response. And again, a very difficult problem, but the people understand the weights. They understand the difference between longitudinal weights and cross-sectional weights, and they say what the weight they use, household and person. Are they using the right weights? I just wonder if maybe Census or someone should kind of try to users on this. It's a very tough problem. I want to say with all these issues and non-response, attrition, imputation, I think the SIP is very representative, and there's no indications of any problems. So I think maybe for some groups you might look at, there might be. But okay, I said I wanted to say some things about some other issues here. Advisory groups. A lot of household surveys have advisory groups. I've served on a number of them. HRS, NLSP, they all have advisory groups. And users, I think SIP could make more use of that. And you need to have a two-way communication there, I think. I think that users tend to use the data sets and they don't understand them, and they make decisions. They don't necessarily go to the trouble of trying to contact somebody at Census to ask and get answers to their questions. So having an advisor user group which can communicate issues from the user community to Census would be good. But the Census, I think, could really communicate more with the user community too. I've mentioned a bunch of issues here that I think that Census knows a lot about the data that users may not be fully cognizant of, and they may not be using them correctly in their analyses. So, it's a two-way street here, and I think more use could be made there. When we're not being very general here, of course, not specific. Content. Okay, what new content? Let's get the user community, and not some survey. Let's have a group of people who drawn from different disciplines and fields who can kind of say, hey, here's what's most needed, we think, and maybe how it could be answered, how many questions, where does something have to be dropped, help Census kind of make the decisions. So that is another purpose. All these technical issues, I can imagine even a second advisory group that's really primarily concerned with these technical statistical issues, because that's a very specialized set of knowledge, and I can imagine that being a little bit different, let's say, than an advisory committee that just represents the views of users on content, something like that. Of course, the conference we have today, I'm really happy to see. We're starting one, and the first inaugural. I hope that's serious. We'll continue to have these advisory committees should help with this, help with the organization of these conferences and publicize them and out to the wider. Advisory can also form a network of SIP users out there. Census already has one, but user groups could really do that and help do the work and establishing networks, and those networks could be very important for the support of the SIP. So I recommend more involvement of the users, or a two-way street there. Now I'm getting a little bit beyond my real expertise here, so I, with some trepidation, recommend that perhaps the SIP should consider some annual reports to Congress on some topic that hopefully Congress will be interested in, and having a regular report so that once a year Congress expects to get these reports, and something about the U.S. population, whether it's program participation or health or demographics or something, and just kind of have a regular thing out there, distribute it widely, get the social media involved, and reporting of this thing. I'm thinking of ways to publicize the SIP, and some of that SIP. If you look at the webpage, the Census staff produces a lot of really great reports right now, so it's very valuable. So I'm have a slightly different purpose here, and for establishing kind of very widespread advertisement and salience of SIP, and and the federal agenda and things like that. Transfer program participation would be the most obvious for that, but there's so many other things that you need. And like I said before, SIPP is unique. It can produce reports on things that the CPS will never be able to report on, any other federal data set. So, there's something I think, again, stepping a little bit outside my knowledge here about what is already being done, but suggesting that is maybe a topic of conversation. And then the final thing is privacy. So we've got however many users here, 70, 80, whatever. I got to tell everybody, this is a coming issue, and every user is going to have to be aware of privacy issues. A data set like SIPP is very vulnerable. You've got 2,900 plus variables, and you've got panel data. You observe them over time. Can somebody with a nice data set out there where they know everybody's names and addresses from a very publicly available data set, plus maybe some private information from a marketing firm? Because remember, firms, are out there collecting data on you guys all the time, and they know a lot about you already. They use that data in conjunction with the SIPP to identify individuals. So, as you all know, that's really come up in the decennial census so far, and it's coming up in the ACS, but it's coming for SIPP. And again, that last bullet, again, I kind of broke a record here, but when you talk about doing things to the SIPP to protect privacy, you've got to involve the users. Okay? You got to involve the users because those things are going to create issues for how to use the data, whether you have to do it inside an FSRDC or not. If noise is ejected, what kind of econometric and system techniques do you use to properly make inferences from the data? And users may need to end up learning some new techniques they don't know right now. So, and there's no real right answer to how much to protect the data set, because the more you protect it, by almost by definition, you have to reduce the usefulness of it a little bit. And here, that balance is really, really difficult, but the users really need to be involved in that. So that's another looking down the future. What things are going to be coming across the user's desk here. I think you should all be prepared that you're going to have to make some investment, and hopefully the census will help you do that in how to address these really important issues. There is a National Academies Committee working on that right now, and so we'll be looking forward to their, I'm a member, but they'll make certain recommendations. But census is going to move ahead and work on this as they know they have to. Anyway, recap: most valuable data sets in the U.S. No question. A really incalculable value. I just can't stress that enough. I face a lot of challenges with the SIPP, and I'm sure census is a great staff will continue to work on those and make progress. And I'm looking forward to seeing developments of progress and all these challenging issues, and hopefully in collaboration with the user community to address those challenges. So let me stop right there. That's my intro slide, and I think I'll just stop sharing and maybe turn it back to you, Shalise, or however you want to handle the Q&A period.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moffitt, for your invaluable insights into the SIPP. We're now into our Q&A portion of the session. So I'm going to invite the audience to raise their hands so that we can call on them, unmute them, and ask them to ask their questions verbally, but we can also monitor the chat if they prefer to use the chat.
Shalise, I think we have one in the chat, and I have a question after that.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jason. Yes, I see the chat. Tao, would you like to unmute yourself to ask the question, or would you rather I read it out?
Go ahead and read it out.
Okay. When exploring high-frequency dynamics within a year with the data reported annually retrospectively, any general suggestions about dealing with the issues? It is known as SIPP effect.
Yeah, that's really important. The same problem. I didn't talk about that, and the nature of the problem has changed a little bit with the the new re-engineered SIPP compared to the old ones. But I have not read what these issues are at the seam right now. I guess you would have the issue that from a December to January period, there might be a seam issue there. But the event history calendars, conceivably, people's memories might be kind of approximate, that create transitions that aren't quite right. But maybe somebody from Census, I'm sure people of Census have really thought about this a lot. Maybe Jason or somebody else could comment on, let's say, seam. Tao, I assume you were talking about the re-engineered SIPP, but not, but at least on that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and it's very fortunate that Jason has a question. Jason definitely is the right person to speak to the SIPP effect and SIPP bias and SIPP. So, Jason, the mic is yours.
Well, I was going to let everyone know. I mean, first of all,
Jason, your voice is coming very faintly through the mic for me. I don't know if that's also the case for Dr. Moffitt.
It looks like it's set up the way it's supposed to. I'll speak a little louder. Yeah, with SIPP as...
Yes, Jason, I think we lost you now.
Is that any better?
Yes, perfect, much better.
Okay. Yeah, so seam bias, of course, SIPP is a panel survey and has historically had significant issues with seam bias, just like any panel survey has. And one of the virtues of the seam months and non...
Jason, you're breaking out again. We lost you.
So this is Dave Waddington. Can you hear me?
Yes, Dave.
So I don't know what's going on with Jason, but I one of the things that I'll just share, I think he was going to get to, is that we do have several individuals within the division that are looking at some seam bias issues and connectivity. So I think we can, that's something that people who have those questions, that would be one of those cases. I'll encourage you to reach out to us and we'll connect you with people who are looking at it. With respect to poverty, I think there's some over in the health insurance and disability area as well. So there's a couple of different folks that are working and looking at that. So we'll be happy to connect you with folks on that. I'll also just put in a plug for PAA. If anybody's going to PAA, we actually pre-PAA, we have a SIPP workshop we're putting on. And if you're going to be there, that's another great time to come talk to us and see that workshop and some tips and tricks. For many of you already know well how to work with the data, but if you want to contribute to that or come learn some more from that, we would love to see you there at PAA if you're going to be there. Let's see if Jason we got him back maybe.
Thank you so much for the announcements, Dave. I see in the chat that Jason was working through the connections. I don't know, Jason, do we have you back? Maybe not yet. But yes, we can absolutely put you in touch with people, the analysts at Census who are working on this issue. Okay, so Jason's still working on switching audio. Are there any other questions from the audience? Either raise your hand, So we can unmute you or put the question in the chat and I will read it out. Okay, so there is a question in the chat. It's about the PAA. For the PAA workshop, does it require pre-registration? Dave, do you know if they need to register for the workshop?
So we have both Jan and Holly on here, and I think the answer is yes, that you do need to register for it. But of course, it's free registration, and we'd love to have anybody. We just need to, I think, know how many people are going to be there so we can be prepared for everybody.
Yes, this is Hyun Shin, and I concur with Dave. You do have to do pre-registration. We'll send it out. Holly Fee and or Adam should be able to send out that information on how to do the registration.
Dave, does the SIPP, I mean, I'm not mistaken, does the census have a just a regular SIPP workshop, every year or something like that for people who want to come in and learn more about how to use it and ask questions and things like that?
Yeah, we've had some history of doing that, and we haven't. What we've actually done, I think, kind of an innovative thing we did, say maybe 2 or 3 years ago, we actually recorded several of those sessions. So if you go to our SIPP page, you can actually watch a series of those working with SIPP sessions that are recorded. And I think what you'll see at PAA is going to be kind of pulling some of that back together again. And that's something certainly we can start back up again as needed. But part of what we did was get the recording, since we couldn't go out obviously all the time. And then the pandemic, conveniently enough, it provided an opportunity to do that sort of training and interaction virtually through those sessions.
Yeah. Well, the BLS does one on the consumer expenditure survey, I think once a year. And I'm a user of that and have attended those occasionally. That's just, it's all, virtual, and they cover different topics. And consumer expenditure survey is a very complicated data set. So users need help, but so is SIPP, and yeah. I don't know, has that ever, you guys ever thought about something like that?
Well, so interestingly enough, it came up in connection with this conference, and we said, okay, let's get this first virtual conference out and see how it goes. But I think that is something that we have discussed as something that we could even connect with this conference if we start doing this on an annual basis, either virtually or in person at some point in the future. But we could then connect like a day ahead of this conference to actually do those workshops. So there has been some talk about it, not all worked out yet.
Well, it's a lot of work, but I know the BLS really puts a lot of effort into their. It takes a lot of time, but they have different subtopics, at the BLS one, and for a particular user, and SIPP is so broad, I can imagine something where you cover different topics in different years, something like that.
No, that's a good idea. We could maybe focus on different areas in different years. I think one thing, so if you don't mind, I'll toss a question out here and somebody else has one, was sort of in reflecting and thinking about the idea of advisory groups or other getting input. I mean, I think we've got our data. We don't have a formal data user group like ACS does and some of the other surveys. We've talked about that, and setting that up is, of course, ACS has a very good structure and a contract to help do that. So if you have thoughts, or if anybody else does, I think, again, we've got a listening session later in the conference. Please come to that. But happy to hear any from you here too. But of how do we set that up, or how could that function sort of in SIPP? We don't quite have the budget per se to do a real big one, but I like the idea of having that, or even if it's an informal user group. And I guess we do have some aspects of that with Adam's staff. The other piece is an advisory group. I like the idea of a technical group too. So I think if we can do that and we have ideas for setting that structure up, I welcome that input because I think that is, as we're looking to the future of SIPP and we're looking at what we can do and how it's going to have to change with a lot of other changes that are coming to the Census Bureau. I think this is the right time for us to be able to have those interactions and get that feedback. So thank you.
Thank you, Dave. I'm looking at the chat. I'm sorry, go ahead, Dr.
No, please go ahead. Are there any other chat questions, Celise?
I don't see anything in the chat. I wanted to just emphasize that the links for the PAA are posted in the chat. And there was an earlier comment by Jason Fields about the synthetic SIPP beta that we're just changing servers. And since you mentioned that it's inoperative in your slides, he's just commenting on the fact that we're moving it to the Census server and it should be available once the move is completed.
Other conferences might be worth, I wouldn't probably recommend it in the American Economic, the AEA, because 20,000 people show up. It's just too big, but smaller ones, I mean, APAM is smaller, and I think there are a lot of policy users of that. Maybe even the National Tax Association is very small. We have a lot of people studying public programs, the benefit side. I mean, the NTA has tax, but they also have benefits and a lot of things there. These smaller ones are kind of always, a little bit easier. You connect with more people. The PA is great. I mean, I would encourage you to do even more.